Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Crisis of the Humanities, Soviet Style, translating Konstantin Vaginov. Globus Books is honored to bring you Ainsley, Morse and Geoff Cebula, who will discuss their work translating the four novels of Konstantin Vaginov, a Soviet modernist writer active in the mid-1920s, early 1930s. Ainsley Morse teaches at Dartmouth College and translates Russian and former Yugoslav literatures. Her recent publications include Permanent Evolution, a collection of theoretical essays by the formalistic critic Yuri Tinyanov, edited and translated with Philip Radko, and other works. Geoff Cebula studies law at Notre Dame. He previously spent a number of years researching and writing about early Soviet literature. His self-published novel, Adjunct, available on Amazon, explains why he spends less time doing that now. And Globus Books is an independent bookstore serving San Francisco since 1971. We run a big collection of tamizdat on top of everything that you can imagine about Russia. Literature, poetry and prose, translated work, literary theory, philosophy, history, and culinary books, and a lot of children's books. So here I would like to pass our virtual microphone to Ainsley and Geoff. Welcome to the show, and we are looking forward to hearing what you got to say about Konstantin Vaginov.
Thank you so much, Zarina. We are very excited to have this opportunity. Like many fans of Vaginov, we spend a lot of time in dark basements, just exulting in this peculiar literature, and so it's really great to have a platform to talk about it with people listening. We were going to start by just talking a little bit about Vaginov. We kind of suspected that maybe many of the people tuning in actually might know a lot about him already, and so we will keep that to a minimum, and then we will intersperse our comments with some excerpts of the translations that we've been working on, and along the way also talk about some of the complications we run into translation-wise in terms of bringing this from Russian into English. So Vaginov has been practically since the time of his writing kind of a cult figure in Russian literature. He died young, which is something that Geoff will talk with us more about, in 1934. And his work actually was published in the Soviet Union, which is not the case for a lot of what we think of as cult Soviet writers. So we'll also touch on that. One thing that we felt should be addressed immediately is his name, Vaginov. So the stress is on the first syllable. And of course, in English, we expect that many of the non-Russian speaking readers of this work will be very excited to have something by Vaginov. We even hope that he may be considered the most popular Russian writer of all time for this reason. But the reason that he has this name is actually also interesting. He was born Konstantin Vaginov. So in Russian, this is a Russianized version of the German last name Wagenheim. His family was a family of Russianized Germans on his father's side. But when World War I broke out, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the Russian Empire. And his father chose to Russianize their last name. So Vaginov became Vaginov with the more Russian suffix. So it definitely doesn't have anything to do with vaginas, but we won't necessarily tell everybody that in case it helps sales of the book. I thought we would also just say briefly how we came to this project. Geoff, do you want to say a couple of things about that since you started it?
Yeah, the way we came around to this, there are a couple of aspects to it, at least from my perspective. The first was just that I read Vaginov's latter two novels, which I'll talk about later, Bambachada and Harpaganiana, and just loved them. I thought they were wonderful and brilliant, and I was upset that no one else had read them. So it was hard to discuss with people. Going to everyone that I met and trying to get them to read Bambachata, and no one enjoyed that tactic. So I thought another way of doing it would be to try to promote it with a new edition. And the other part of it is we came around to this project in 2016, which was around a time when I had just finished my dissertation, and I was thinking about kind of doing things that were not in academia long term. And I was trying to think of what would be a worthwhile project that I would be excited to do and would actually care about if I didn't have an academic career, like something. Frankly, a lot of the articles that I was working on, I was not excited about and would not care about if I didn't have an academic career. So I was trying to think of something that would be more important. And I realized 2 of Vaginov's novels weren't translated. And the first 2, hard to find editions and not always the ideal translations. So I really wanted to get this going. And then I thought, who would be someone who's capable of this work? Didn't really think of myself, but someone had to sign on as a co-translator. But I immediately thought of Ainsley because she's a phenomenal translator. And I asked her to get on and she wanted to do it. And so here we are. And I'll go back to Ainsley to talk about.
I also have some small noises that might come up in the background. So just to say briefly I was so delighted when Geoff suggested the project. I have been a huge fan of Vaginov for many years. In fact, like I said, he's a cult figure, a cult writer in Russia, but he is also a kind of a cult writer among a lot of American Slavicists. I have heard that many professors have secret files of partial translations of these novels, like hidden off in their files. So we're the first ones to take it to publishing, but we are probably not the only ones to work on this material. I first encountered Vaginov in the context of working on the poets of the Abriu group, kind of absurdist group of young poets in the late 1920s, early 1930s, who Vaginov was briefly affiliated with. And this leads into something that we wanted to say about Vaginov in general that's important, which is that he was first a poet. And so these novels that we are working on were something he came to late in his writing career, which is relative since he lived so briefly. But they were the last thing that he did, following several collections of poetry. And the novel, the prose, has a very much a poetic sensibility. And there's also a thematic tie-in to some of what we'll be talking about under this umbrella term of crisis of the humanities, because in the novels, poetry is kind of symbolically tied to this old, obsolete, pre-revolutionary world. So in some ways, it's almost as though Vaginov is saying that prose, crude, rough prose, is more appropriate to this new zeitgeist of the Soviet period that he's working in. So on that note, I wanted to read, just for a brief example, an excerpt from Vaginov's first novel, which we're translating under the title Goat Song. It's called in Russian Kozlinaya Piesin. More on that a little later. And so this is actually a brief passage written in the first person from the author, who is a character in the novel. And there's a couple of these sprinkled throughout the novel, and they're entitled interword, междусловие, which is a neologism. And so this one kind of sets a scene and gives you a sense of this poetic prose. I awoke in a room with a rotunda giving out onto the street. It's quiet here, though God knows what goes on in the evenings. Some philosophizing superintendent with a crimson nose will dive up out of the darkness, or a dog resembling a wolf will run past dragging a person. Or 2 passers-by, their collars lifted, will stop by the lamppost and, swaying, give each other a light. Or a loud shriek will light up the surrounding area. Continuing from this, I mentioned that the author is a character in this novel. So that already gives you a sense of the very forward-thinking ahead of its time kind of meta orientation of this novel and of all four of Vaginov's novels. For another example, in this same novel, the first one, the author invites his characters for a dinner party, at which they play a literary game of exquisite corpse. The second novel that I'm going to be talking about today, also the second chronologically, we have translated as The Works and Days of Whistlin. And so before I read you an example of how this novel is also playing with the kind of self-conscious narration that I've talked about, I have to say something about how we're translating the names. Because I think that our listeners who are familiar with Vaginov will be very intrigued by this. So like Nikolai Gogol, who is a major 19th century writer, a great influence on Vaginov, Vaginov plays around with what we call speaking names. And so the names of his characters matter, and they are often kind of ridiculous. They more or less fit into the norms of Russian last names in terms of their form, but they stand out because they're very, they signify a lot. And so when we first started working on this, it was one of the first things that came up, because it seems like you can't just translate a last name like Kotikov and Rotikov, which is a pair in the novel, or the main character of Goat Song, Tipcholkin, who actually considers the ridiculousness of his name in the novel. You can't just translate that by putting those sounds into English, because they don't mean in the same way. So we really struggled with this all throughout. And as I just said, the title of Vaginov's second novel in our translation is The Works and Days of Whistlin. In Russian, his name is Svistonov. So the root there is whistle. And so we were working with that sound. In some of the other examples, like the main character, Tipcholkin of Goat Song, we had to get more creative. So we have translated him, for instance, as Baumkafkin, which we think is, I love that Vanya is laughing. I'm glad, effective. Similarly, in that novel, you have these paired characters, Kostya Rotikov and Misha Kotikov, and we have done them as Kosta Kissenkin and Misha Kittenkin. So we have we have a kisser instead of a mouse. We have a kitten, right, instead of a tomcat. But that worked out pretty well too.
Say as an aside, I was initially very hesitant about doing these speaking names because I was afraid that they wouldn't play, and I had a lot of concerns about it. And then Ainsley came to me with Baumkafkitten, and I was just like, all right, we're doing it. This is brilliant.
So we plan to publish these novels as a 2-volume set. So the 2 earlier novels that I translated will be 1 volume, and the 2 later novels that Geoff's going to talk about in a minute will be volume 2. And we plan to have a paragraph note on names included in each one, because it's important to point out what we're doing, because these are clearly not Russian names. We're working with roots and sounds that are more English. So I wanted to say that before reading this excerpt from The Works and Days of Whistlin, just to explain the name so that people know which book I'm talking about. But this is more of a testament, again, to that kind of self-conscious writing style. So this is from early in the novel. Whistlin stretched out under the blanket and smoked, gazing at the ceiling. Then he turned and began gazing at the wall. He felt the urge to write. He picked up a book and started reading. Whistlin did not write in a systematic manner. It was not the case that an image of the world suddenly appeared before him, or that everything became suddenly clear. And that was not when he wrote anyway. On the contrary, all of his works emerged from vague scribblings in the margins of books, from stolen metaphors, skillfully rewritten pages, overheard conversations, from inverted rumors. Whistlin lay in bed and read, that is, wrote, since for him this was one and the same thing. He would mark off a paragraph with red pencil, then use a black one to insert it in reworked form into his own manuscript. He didn't worry about the meaning of the whole or the coherence of it all. Coherence and meaning would appear later. And then from slightly later in the book, even more of a kind of credo, Whistlin was working. He wrote, read, and acted quite at ease. He translated living people and, pitying them slightly, strove to enchant with rhythms, the music of vowels, and with intonation. He had, to be frank, nothing to write about. He just took people and translated them. But since he had talent, and since he saw no fundamental difference between the living and the dead, and since he had his own world of ideas, everything came out in an unprecedented and strange light. Music and art, courtesy and life, such were Whistlin's shields. This is why Whistlin went pale when he committed a faux pas. So just to make sure that Geoff has plenty of time to talk as well about the other two novels, I'm going to just say a couple things about this about the two novels, just since I've given you a taste of what they sound like, but I want to say a little bit more about what happens in them. So in the first novel, Goat Song, you do have several main characters. You have these meandering subplots and a lot of authorial digressions. It was famously read in its time as a roman à clef, meaning kind of disguised portraits of real people that could be traced, and basically making fun of Vaginov's own literary circle in Leningrad. One example of this is that there's a character, Zaifradsky, who we translate as Euphratesky, like the river Euphrates, who is a transparent portrait of the famous poet Nikolai Gumilyov. And he's dead already at the time of writing of the novel, but the antics of the poets who are kind of tussling over how he will be memorialized and his unfortunate widow are really lampooned very seriously. The characters in this novel are pretty much universally ridiculous, but in my reading, it's a kind of elevated ridiculousness because it comes out of being tragically out of sync with their time. And so this makes them, for the most part, pretty sympathetic until they start making really serious compromises, which is also a major theme in the novel. And so just again, as an illustration of the crisis of the humanities theme, I'm going to read a longer excerpt from this novel, Goat Song, to introduce a few of the characters and this theme. So this is from maybe a third of the way into the novel. It features Balmkafkin, who we've already talked about, and Kosta Kisenkin, and a character called the Unknown Poet, who is another sort of double of the author of Vaginov in the novel. Balmkafkin glanced out the window to see whether the unknown poet was coming and saw that indeed he was, tapping his walking stick, waving his hat, and carrying a new manuscript. I will now make merry in an unknown land, thought Balmkafkin, and ran to open the door. They kissed in greeting, cursed modernity, spat with feeling onto a group of young pioneers passing by. What a generation this is, lacking all humanist sentiment, genuine future representatives of the medieval age, fanatics, barbarians, unenlightened by the light of the humanities. Yes, nastiness and beastliness all around, barbarization, nodded Balmkafkin. They sat. And there has always been nastiness and beastliness all around, loathsome tramping, Balmkafkin continued after some thought. I'm imagining how those white guard types must wreak havoc in their consulates abroad. Before the new ambassador can move in, they tear down the wallpaper, spit all over the ceiling, and rip up the parquet. They don't sit down by the fireplace to enjoy one last moment of melancholy, admire the walls hung with fine fabric. They don't stroll through the rooms or go out into the garden, if there's a garden. Better not to philosophize, the unknown poet shrugged. You and I have long since survived our own ruin. For me, in artifice, you in literature, and no ruin can surprise us now. The man of culture lives out his spiritual life in many different countries, not just one, in many different times, not merely his own, and he can choose any ruin he wishes. He's not sad, just bored. When death comes to him at home, he'll just bellow, "You again," and it'll seem funny. Baum-Kafkin became sad, very sad. He walked over to the window. What delightful tanned children those pioneers are, he thought, and smiled. For some reason, he felt a jolt of joy and freshness, as if a gust of sun-drenched air had burst into the room. There it is, the youth of the world again, he thought. Meanwhile, Kosta Kisinkin came into the room. You write astonishing poems, he addressed the unknown poet. True Baroque. Kosta Kisinkin had a distinct way of moving. His whole body moved with elegance. He had come to Baum-Kafkin's today to whisk away the unknown poet and have a talk with him about kitsch. He collected tasteless and pornographic things as such. Often he, that is Kosta Kisinkin and the unknown poet, would visit flea markets and pick out ashtrays. On one side, the ashtray would be perfectly decent, while the flip side was entirely obscene. On the one side, a lady would be walking with her admirer's face smiling after her, while on the other. Kosta Kisinkin bought not only pornographic postcards, but also postcards that were decent and yet repulsive. A mustachioed, red-cheeked squire dining with a lady in a restaurant and pressing her foot under the table with his boot. A maiden with a rolled coiffure playing the harp. A naked nymph running with a mug of beer, chased by a man in Tyrolean costume. So that gives you a good sense of who's running around in that novel, hopefully. I'll just briefly, I think I have said enough for now about the Whistling novel, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Geoff to hear a little bit about the later novels, and I do have some more excerpts from both that we can get back to later if we have time.
Yeah, and Kosta Kisinkin is a great note to transition on because part of the reason why we broke up novels the way we did is that the latter two really work together as a unit. They're very closely tied to each other. Even one character, Toropulo, carries over between the two novels, although with some very serious changes. But they're really united by their dedication to kind of sundries of material culture, especially kitsch, and various ephemera. And let me see if I cannot do screen sharing, but if you looked at the poster for this event, you probably you would have seen the candy wrapper that we picked out as that image, and that's a kind of prime example of the type of item that really plays a central role throughout these second novels. Candy wrappers, postcards, menus, recipe books come up, and we'll have more to say on that later. But really, the second two novels, they could be called the collector novels, the fetishist novels. They are about kind of a society of, I don't want to totally say outsiders, because some of them, Toropulo being the prime example, are fairly well integrated into Soviet society. Yet their passions are not passions for the public eye. And their interests in life are not political interests. They are obsessed with various items or forms of entertainment that they trade and share with each other. And that's another reason why I really like the particular candy wrapper that Ainsley picked out, where we have these two wrestlers, in the middle of a match, because there is a lot about male homosexuality and mutual entertainment and using recreational activities as kind of a medium for creating bonds. And if we put this under the general rubric of crisis of the humanities and crisis of a kind of humanistic society, we definitely see that hitting a fever pitch in Ainsley's two novels. And then I think in Bambachada, we kind of have a moment of equilibrium, where you have these kind of weirdos just living on the margins of society, but they start forming bonds and kind of forming interests and even forming like kind of mutual research collectives, just looking through the trash heap of this fallen society. And like you get these real social bonds. And this character that I keep mentioning, Torpulo, who doesn't have a first name, he's an engineer. He's also a gourmand, and he hosts these like elaborate parties where he cooks these 19th or 18th century French recipes using whatever ingredients he can find locally. And just we're saying these pay-ins to food and food culture, and his enthusiasm just spreads to everyone, and he's the center of Bambachada and the center of the society that is kind of functioning, right? When you kind of make the step over to Harpagonyiana, the last novel, you see that kind of outsider society of enthusiasts and fetishists collapse, and you kind of, so Torpulo is a central figure in a lot of ways. He's not the center of the narrative per se, and I'll get back to who that is in a moment. But sort of all of the social networks throughout Bambachada, they all go through Torpulo. And his apartment is the kind of social hub of that novel and what keeps everything cohesive. You go to Harpagonyiana, and the central figure, the one that everyone's tied to, is this horrific scoundrel and drunk and furtive who basically steals and swindles things from people, resells them to other people, uses the profits to get drunk, disappears when Vasilev's kills for 24 hours, wakes up naked in a park somewhere, and then starts the cycle again, right? And so you don't have this like central hub that everyone goes to. It's this itinerant figure who just takes things from people, and but he's sort of like the central figure. So all of this is to say that if in, say, a goat song, there's kind of a worry about the fall of the ivory tower and of a kind of like high culture and academia, there is a thriving thrash culture that a thriving trash culture that like grows up in Bambachada, and then that falls as well in Harpagonyiana. And so I think if we want to trace like a fall, rise, or not even rise, just sort of leveling off and then second fall of humanities through the novels. And that's kind of what happens. And it's really felt, I think, in these latter two novels that it's also a formation and disintegration of social bonds, mainly male. There are some female characters, but the social bonds that Vaginov is interested in are between men. And so, yeah, so that's sort of my general orientation on those novels. By way of just kind of setting up what I'm going to be reading from Bambachada. Well, first I should explain the title because not everyone's heard of Bambachada. It's a word that comes from the world of genre painting. It's specifically applied to the followers of a painter known as Il Bamboccio van Leer. And so genre painting depictions of everyday life. He was a little bit more known for depictions of kind of scoundrels, pickpockets, like the kind of was seen as the low end of everyday life. And appropriately, the center of the narrative is this character named Yevgeny Fellin-Flein. Fellin-Flein, I mean, it's a Germanist name, but He's a self-styled scoundrel. He goes from town to town, ripping people off in various ways that he thinks are really cute and adorable. But I don't think they come across to the reader that way, but he's very like enthusiastic about his own kind of scams. And he even specifically like looks at old Dutch and Flemish drawings and compares himself to the pickpockets he sees in them. And that's kind of like how he likes that's just sort of how he relates to the world, as just never taking anything seriously, always keep moving. And so, he's sort of our tour guide through Torpolo's world and through this world of bizarre collectors. But then the narrative takes a very pronounced turn. And I think actually really it becomes a narrative only at the end, because the first part just feels like this weird montage of scenes from various dinner parties that don't necessarily have the most relationship to each other. And it's kind of hard to track. I think it's really entertaining, but it's really hard to track a clear narrative thread. But then toward the end of the novel, maybe with about 20 pages left, Yevgeny becomes sick, and he starts, he sees doctors. The diagnosis per se isn't discussed, but it's fairly clear that, like Vaginov himself, he has tuberculosis. And he ends up, he decides he doesn't really want to be around any of the people that he spent time with anymore, so he leaves town, first goes to a kind of a smaller town outside Petersburg, kind of acts the part of a knave in the social scene there. And then he finally does go to a sanatorium for treatment. And that's placed in today's Pushkin Tsarskaya Selo. And so, he spends a lot of time in the sanatorium proper, but he also spends a lot of time walking on the grounds of this beautiful imperial park, and kind of admiring the grounds. And so this is what I'm going to be reading from. And I should mention that I'm going to mention a hermitage. It's a pavilion in Tsarskaya Selo, just so that's clear. All right, so this is from toward the end of Bamachada. Here in the sanatorium, Yevgeny sensed that he was mortal. They would have to part with the world of play. There wouldn't be another opportunity to direct a line dance on the fresh, beautiful grass, to take morning walks along the dark blue streets, to duck into buildings of various architectural styles, to drink tea at various temperatures, to play piano, to teach young girls about love, to dissolutely read, listen to stories, put on a show, to let out an exaggerated sneeze, to cough, laugh, eat, or drink. Yevgeny shook his head and his lip trembled. He covered his face with his hands. How wondrously the world now sparkled for him. The foliage shone emerald, the sand reddish, the clouds ashen blue, the stars snowy gold. Unexpected and beautiful seemed the people, animals, and plants. How lovely the world is, yet I have to abandon it, resounded the music in Yevgeny's ears. Yevgeny approached the baroque glittering hermitage across a brittle cover of ice. It stood atop a barely noticeable rise in the ground. The hermitage was surrounded on every side by cupids. Yevgeny became fascinated. Here were some fat-cheeked cupids draping flowers on a bowl. Others were feeding fruits to a lion. A third grouping was gathering flowers in baskets. The fourth slept amicably under the starry sky. The fifth watched the rising sun. The sixth flew a kite. The seventh was forging arrows. The eighth chatted in the shadow of a fountain. The ninth pair was amorously occupied in bed, the woman preparing to put on a crown, and the man bringing her flowers. The 10th was gathering brush. The 11th was warming themselves by the fire, but Yevgeny especially liked the cupids gathering grapes. One was examining a cluster, another was filling his basket, and the third, who stood inside a giant barrel, was joyfully exerting himself and smiling playfully as he crushed ripe grapes. And then a little further along, when he's back at the sanatorium, Yevgeny went to examine his lodgings. On the wall of a building near the resort hung a poster depicting a machine man. In the expansive rooms of this machine man were people at work. Some climbed up and down the stairs, piling up starch and sugar. Others were serving food. A third group served as gatekeepers to the duodenum. A fourth reflected on their reading. A fifth sat atop wooden horses. A sixth was filming with a camera, the eye. The seventh listened at the telephone, the ear. The young women in blue and gray dresses sat at various instruments, the nerves. Inside the machine man, blue and red pipes had been laid. Wheels and trolleys were in motion, and drive belts were at work. Out of boredom, Yevgeny inspected this artificial and allegorical representation. Without a doubt, it was a very interesting poster. Its goal was to make sure that those who labored remembered which organs produced what, where they were located, and how they worked. For Yevgeny, this poster expressed an entire worldview. He silently compared it with prints depicting man with various planets on his forehead, cheeks, chest, arms, and legs. And the kind of parallel between various realia of Soviet life and various things from the historical periods that Yevgeny reads about and collects accounts of. It comes up through the novel. That's sort of a beloved pastime of his. And I think just so we have time to discuss other issues in translation, I won't do too much of a introduction into Protagonists, other than to reiterate that it's definitely a much darker novel. You will that was a very melancholic passage by Bambachada standards, but I think even in comparison to that, you will hear a change in tone with this one. And and part of I think what's interesting about Protagonists and pairing the two together is it answers a question that I think is looming in Bambachada, which is all these people have all these like strange items, right? And it's clear that they can get a lot of them pretty cheap because being sold in flea markets across the town. There are these bookstores that Wagner himself would frequent in Leningrad at the time. But like, how do they keep getting new items? And like, how does this economy sustain itself? Propaganda is really about the economy. It's about the sellers, and it's about what people go through, what they have to sell off to get the funds for these things, and what they do to the people in their lives in order to be able to have the time and the resources to collect things. And so that's the world that we enter, and we enter it through the persona of this grimy man named Julombin. He's got kind of like gritty graying locks and lives in an extremely damp room, and its dampness is just repeated again and again. And I don't think it's mentioned in the passage that I'm reading, but like when you're picturing this, you should just feel the dampness in the air and picture the wallpaper peeling from the walls around him. So I'm going to start with and he's a collector, but as you'll see, he's a collector without the sense of enthusiasm and, well, yes, his own kind of enthusiasm, but without like the purpose and without the same kind of interest in culture that the collectors in Bambachada had. So I'll read a little bit about his collection, and then a passage from slightly after that kind of describes his social sphere. The bureau contained papers, some covered in writing, others not. Sculpted wine bottles, dried up medicines stamped with the imperial two-headed eagle, pressed leaves, dried flowers, beetles covered in tiny spiders, butterflies devoured by moths, wedding invitations, children's, ladies, and men's calling cards, some with drawings of crowns on them, pieces of bread with nails in them, cigarettes with strings protruding like horns from the tobacco, rolls filled with cockroaches, specimens of imperial and revolutionary era cookies, specimens of bourgeois and proletarian wallpaper, stubs of state and foreign concession pencils, postcards reproducing world-renowned paintings, used and unused pens, prints, lithographs, a John of Kronstadt stamp, an assortment of enema bags, artificial and real gems. Of course, there were very few real ones. Invitations to Komsomol and anti-religious events, to a tea hour celebrating a visiting delegation, and to speeches about the international situation. Packs of tramcar slogans, of posters celebrating May Day, one mounted victory banner. There was even an Order of the Turtle for servile sluggishness and liquidating illiteracy. The man looked over his room with pride. All of this was his to systematize and catalog. All of this was his to distribute among the appropriate categories. And in this next passage, we'll be referring to Jolumben by his nickname in the novel. The systematizer paid visits to people who owned sundry trifles. Outside his regular job teaching Dutch, the systematizer had plenty of work. The city had no lack of hoarders. The accountant Klein, for instance, collected anything that had a picture of Petersburg on it, from postcards to beer labels. An elderly Don Juan, the director of a small theater, collected whistles. A film actor collected ladies' gloves. Some people collected bits of lace, scraps of brocaded fabric, little beads, or trimming from ladies' clothing. The city was a goldmine for all these people, a northern El Dorado, a new Herculaneum in Pompeii. These individuals spent all of their free time, as well as time that wasn't entirely free, on its excavation. They excavated the rooms of barely moving old women and men who were still hanging on to one thing or another. Overcome with the lust for personal property, others collected something other than objects, something that nonetheless possessed a certain taste and scent. For instance, curses, jokes, fine literary phrases, slips of the tongue, violations of the Russian language. Some of these hoarders indulged in proud fantasies, exaggerating the aesthetic value of certain objects, lace. Others explained their stockpiling of ladies' gloves by citing a desire to write a particular book, the history of ladies' gloves. Yet others explained it as love for sights that please the eye, brocade. And so the systematizer among these peculiar capitalists, bandits, and outlaws, who had no qualms about thievery, who were willing to make off with objects valued by little old men and women, often only for the memories. These collectors were true leeches on the working class, elusive, greedy, and cruel. Imperceptibly, they transformed their acquaintances into workers. By using moral persuasion, they forced them to labor toward the accumulation of individual wealth. This sector of society boasted a trade and cash economy, unregulated by the state, purchases and sales undetected by the financial organs. Here, people would pay quite handsomely for a tobacco label from the first half of the 19th century, or gilded trademark. These bloodsuckers didn't take out patents. Theirs was a free association of thieves, in conditions prohibitive to the private accumulation of wealth. They, nonetheless, invading all laws, indulged their passion. So you can see a little bit of the bleak world, and obviously at the end, it's not without a significant dollop of irony, engages in some, official, political Soviet disprobrium of these people, but the way their depictions are depicted otherwise is also quite dark. And I think with that, I'll turn it back to Ainsley.
I think we wanted to leave some time before question and answer to talk also about some of the other things we've run into just translation wise, just for the translation geeks in the audience. But I did want to read one more excerpt from the second novel, Whistling, that I think kind of rhymes in a nice way with what Geoff just read, and also really demonstrates the progression that you so nicely laid out for us, because there is basically just an increasing darkness in these novels as they go, and you could hear at the end of what Geoff just read this kind of despairing parody of Soviet language, Soviet Marxist language of economics that is applied to these collectors who in the earlier two novels are also significant figures, but are seen as more like charming, ineffectual eccentrics, rather than as sinister bloodsuckers on the working masses, as we hear about the systematizer. At the same time, Vaginov is very unsparing of all of his characters from the very beginning. And so I think that the passage I'm going to read, which again gets into the very unscrupulous writing methods of the main character, Whistlin, the author, also kind of, you hear not echoes, but like a taste of things to come in what comes in the later novels. So this is from a part of the novel where it's a very idyllic setting. So the main characters have gotten out of Petersburg. This is something actually that happens in all four novels. You have these substantial chunks of the books that are set in the beautiful little towns and parks that surround, usually imperial parks that surround St. Petersburg. So they've all gone out to the countryside. And that's probably the only background you need to know for this bit. So, Whistlin, Trina Rubles, the deaf washerwoman, Cuckoo, and Nadinka, the city girl, sat among the dacha dwellers. Trina Rubles was a woman with a past. She was luscious, wild, and had until recently possessed great beauty. But about 2 years ago, she had let herself go, turned flabby. Her ash blonde hair no longer provoked similes, and her pink cheeks had gone yellow and pasty. Whistlin squeezed the washerwoman's hand, and having made sure no one could hear him and knowing that she wouldn't hear him, told her stories, ridiculing the deaf former beauty. She watched his lips and wondered at what point she ought to laugh. Here I've gotten Cuckoo together with this girl, Whistlin continued, stroking the deaf woman's hand. Later, I'll transport them into another world, one more real and eternal than this momentary life. They will live in it, and when they're already in the grave, they'll only just have started to experience their prime and will go on changing for eternity. Art is extracting people from one world and drawing them into a different sphere. There are very few true soul hunters in this world. There is nothing more terrifying than a true hunter. They are quiet, these true hunters. They are polite because politeness is the only thing that links them to the outside world. Naturally, they have neither horns nor hooves. Naturally, they pretend to love life, but they only really love art. Please understand, continued Whistlin, knowing that the deaf woman would understand nothing. Art is no festivity. Art is not labor. It is the struggle to populate that other world, to ensure that it too is densely populated, that it contain diversity, that life there too is full. Literature can be compared to life after death. Literature in actual fact is life after death. So I think that the connection that I want to draw here is that, of course, the characters in the two later novels, these really repulsive and absolutely reprehensible morally, aesthetically, whatever, these characters are, of course, artists, right? And so in the very beginning of the first of these four novels, Vaginov is basically building coffins for art, and he does so in kind of an increasingly aggressive way throughout all four of the novels. This novel, not to ruin it or cut down on sales or anything, but it ends with Whistlin writing himself into his own work, where he has trapped so many, unethically trapped and destroyed so many people in this collecting, because he is also a collector. Okay. We can, of course, we still have more excerpts if we want to read more later, but we did want to have time to talk a little bit about some of our translation issues. We already talked about the names, which is a huge one, and that we are still working out. I mean, there's a lot of characters in these books, and as we edit, we're still working on some of those. Geoff is going to tell us about just a few of the many crazy research wormholes that have that we have gone down because of the wealth of very obscure detail that Vaginov provides us with. We should also probably just say, again, in line with this crisis of the humanities, that Vaginov had an excellent education, an excellent pre-revolutionary education, and in his first youth belonged to absolutely every possible cultural and literary grouping that existed in Petrograd and Leningrad, and so he puts this erudition into the books, even as he's deconstructing its fundamental value in this context that he's in. So Geoff, do you want to talk about a wormhole or two, and then we can?
No, I'm happy to go on the wormholes. They are. I think I ended up with two novels that are most conducive to wormholes because there's just so much material and intellectual culture that is cataloged in various segments of it. So, you know, and usually not any kind of depth. It'll just be a passing reference to something, some kind of odd-looking object, or you know, like everything that I was reading that was in that bureau. You know, if you look into kind of catalogs of Soviet artifacts from that time, like you can find images, or pre-revolutionary in some instances. You know, you can find what kind of calling cards he was talking about, what kinds of, you know, when he describes particular candy wrappers, usually you can't always find the particular wrapper, but a lot of times you can. And I'm sure someone else could find the particular one, but, you know, at least for my purposes, I'm happy if I find one close enough. Yeah, and similarly with like references to literary works, there are a lot of quotes that are just dropped from God knows where, right? And you have to try to find what he's referencing. And, you know, it's helpful that there's a very good academic edition of Vaginov, and, you know, obviously use that, but there's also stuff that even they weren't able to track down. So there's a fair amount to look into. I mean, and especially because when he does historical references, Vaginov likes to take the less common figures. He has kind of a, I don't want to say hipster taste, but that's sort of what I'm going for. I mean, that you know, when he talks about composer, to be like Lully, I don't know, it was a French last name, but like a very minor figure in the story of French opera. Or there's one work, it's called John Locke's Polka, which took a really long time to track down, because I think from the original edition, it was translated incorrectly as Poke's Polka instead of Locke's Polka. And then, but I'm fairly certain at this point that he's referring to a work known as John Locke's Polka. You know, and so, the most fun thing for me to research, and this is what I put on the handout, so everyone can look at it, are a lot of the culinary items that there's references to recipes, to menus from famous events and things like that. And even beyond like the names of cookbooks and things like that, there are a number of moments where Vaginov describes someone cooking. And he describes it in enough detail that you can reconstruct the recipe. So that's what I've done for everyone. You can't reconstruct cooking times, so those are up to your judgment. And, you know, so maybe, you know, like try a couple of Food Network like chicken recipes first. Get your cooking time sense down. You know, get a strong grounding in fundamentals, and then go for the pigeon that I've given you, or the leg of lamb, or my favorite, which is a Muscovite hangover cure that is, you know, actually from a travel log. I want to say 16th century. I should have looked up before doing this, but it's from an old travel log. I believe it was an English diplomat who was traveling through Russia and noted this old Muscovite cure, which Torpula makes for his friends the morning after a long night of discussing food, playing music on glasses, and drinking. And it's very simple. You just, I mean, it's simple assuming that you eat mutton with some regularity, which not everyone does these days. But if you have mutton lying around, you want the cubes to be uneven for your mutton. You toss in you take some pickles, slice them thinly, and just mix it with vinegar and and pickle juice, and there you go. Hangover gone. So, just keep that in your back pocket. And on the handout, you can see all the recipes that we found. But I will also admit that there have been a couple of things that I haven't been able to track down. There's one quote. It looks like it's from Trilby. It seems like it's something that has to do with Svengali. It's not. And the academic edition doesn't have a source for it. I cannot find a source searching for equivalents of the phrase in multiple language. Like, I just have no idea what the hell it's from. But the most frustrating one for me is this phrase that we have. It's from a discussion of Totopoulos' father going to a restaurant and seeing someone use, it's called a pero a la koi. So it's like a feather quill a la koi to clean his teeth. Now, there's some things that we can tell pretty early on. Oh, and the other thing about it is pero is in quotation marks, right? So it's a pero a la koi. So if you look into the history of toothpicks, which everyone should, it's clear that in the latter half of the 19th century, quills became a dominant form of teeth cleaning device. The reason being that a lot of people were farming ducks, and the duck meat market went south, and so they needed something to do with the ducks, so they were selling feathers. So quills became huge for tooth cleaning in the late 19th century. A little bit after the quill boom, there was a very common practice of making synthetic quills, and I don't remember out of what material. But synthetic quills became actively marketed in the early 20th century, and this note probably happened around 1905, maybe a little bit before that. So my guess is a synthetic quill, which would explain the quotation marks, potentially. Maybe not, could be wrong, but that's my guess. A la koi, though, it seems to mean nothing. I've searched people named koi, any French word that could be misspelled as koi, C-O-Y, and I can find absolutely nothing that would link koi to teeth or to quills. And if anyone in the YouTube world, the Facebook world, the Zoom world has any idea on a la koi, I would be so grateful for guidance. So this is a call out to all of you, beaming a light, asking for help. But yes, so that's the most frustrating of my research wormholes. I think that's all I want to say on the research. Another kind of not so much a research task, or a little bit of that, but just translation task is there's this character named Mirovoy, who is this kind of
we should say who we are waffling about calling him Le Monde. Or just like a more straight translation of global.
Yeah, global is the other one. We have a lot of possibilities, none that we're totally satisfied with. So views of Voy are also welcome. But he's sort of like this gangster figure. It's well known among people who know things about Vaginov that he researched kind of criminal slang of his era, and so Mirovoy speaks in a lot of it. And so one of the kind of threshold questions is how much do you want to reproduce that in English, right? Because I'm very I think it would be fun to have him speaking as a 1920s gangster, but I also don't know if that, a lot of the kind of better known gangster slang from the 20s sounds really goofy if you use it in English. And it looks kind of like a caricature, like someone's doing a bad Al Capone impression. And then there is more esoteric slang. You can easily find dictionaries of like slang from that era, but like if you use the lesser known slang, then it's not at all clear what he's saying. And probably there's a little bit of that. That's some of Vaginov's readers might have had to use context clues for some of the phrases, but like most of it would have been pretty easy to figure out. So like you don't want to make it like super inaccessible. So you know, that's one thing that we're working on. And the other thing related to him is he has a lot of these kind of like chanson, like I don't know, kind of ballad type
Murder ballads.
Murder ballads. Yeah, he has these fun like murder ballads that are really fun
They're
to
documentary
translate.
material, right? I mean, because
Yeah,
they're authentic from the time. So one we can give a shout out, Zarina. I know that I think you've had Borja Dralyuk on this program. So a wonderful translator colleague of ours, Boris Dralyuk, and he did one of my favorite translations into English ever, which is a translation of Isaac Babel's Odessa stories. And he very much, I mean, it was not it could be seen as a controversial choice, but he takes pretty much the idiom of like New York, Jewish New York 1920s, and makes it work for Odessa of the same time period. And so we are enlisting his consultation for what should we do with our gangster, since it seems like something that Boris is particularly good at.
Yeah, he is coming back actually to with this exact topic. He's going to speak about Odessa slang and gangster slang sometimes in fall. So
Awesome.
People who are interested come back, and that will be fun.
Yeah, we should say for anyone who's listening that if you're one of the people who has Vaginov in your desk drawer, or if you have any great ideas about how to solve some of these problems, like I am very open to collaboration in translation. I think it's the best. And together we are stronger. So some of the other things, I think we've covered the more interesting translation issues that we've run into. Some of the other things are more like stuff you run into all the time when you're translating from Russian into English. Vaginov is particularly troublesome because, as you could tell from some of the very list-heavy passages that Geoff was reading, he has these long sentences that are packed full of stuff, and syntactically, it's usually quite important what comes when. And so this relates to an overarching problem about how to translate Vaginov, because his style is sometimes very odd. And there's a temptation that I think I've seen. There really haven't been very many translations of Vaginov, but there have been a couple attempts. And there's this temptation generally in translating to think, okay, this is weird in the original, so I'm just going to translate it the way it is, and it'll be weird in English too. But of course, it will be weird in English in a different way, and usually not a very good way. And so there's this question of very practical question, how do I maintain the syntax, the order of things in the sentence, and then a stylistic question, how do I make this weird in English in a way that somehow replicates the way that it's weird in Russian, but still making it weird really in English. And I think that's a problem that anybody translating modernist prose is running into, especially from Russian. There's another thing that comes up a lot, of course, is this very distinct contrast that Vaginov draws thematically between the old world and the new world. So the old pre-revolutionary world and the new Soviet world. And of course, this difference is linguistic as much as cultural and everything, and political and everything else. And they can sometimes be tricky to figure out, how do I really make this character sound like someone who is purposefully adopting this Navayaz, this new brave new language of the Soviet system, versus somebody who is stubbornly sticking to a more old-fashioned way of speaking, since English doesn't have that same rift that is so palpable in Russian of the 20th century.
And just to continue on the kind of mundane-ish syntactic issues that we run into that can be just really frustrating is, I think a relatively typical poet writing in prose issue where a lot of the effect is based on the order of the images, right? But simultaneously, a lot of the effect is based on the rhythm of the prose. And because English syntax doesn't like to order things the same way Russian does, a lot of times either it almost feels like you have to choose between the two. Like either you lose the rhythm completely, but you keep the right order of images. Which from Vaginov's own writing on poetics, like order of images was something that was very, very important to him, and specifically the relationship between two successive images. But then you don't want to like totally lose the rhythm, and so trying to find syntactic constructions that work for that. And I mean, I think what I've found myself tending to do more and more that I was reluctant to do early on was just like substituting for a totally different verb, because a lot of times the verb feels like not as important as a lot of like the images that he's piling together. And so like finding a verb in English that will let me put the images in the right order, or maybe it's like more toggling between it being a passive construction or an active one, and kind of, which feels a little bit like interfering with the sense of it, but sometimes I feel like that's the only way to keep the effect. But again, that's a fairly mundane problem, but it's just on the really long sentences that he puts together in some of these novels, it can be a struggle.
If maybe we should take a couple questions if anybody has them.
I'm curious what you did with the verses in the novels. How did you treat the poetry?
It's of course one of the hardest parts of translating the novels that have poems in them. I mean, so Geoff talked a little bit about the more documentary in nature poems that are in Harpaganiana, and I can't. There's a similar thing in Bambachada, right, Geoff, with the verses that are like graffiti.
Yeah, it's sort of a really fun section when Evgeny's walking through the grounds of Catherine Park, and he sees in Tsarskaya Selo, and he sees all this graffiti on various benches and various buildings, and a lot of it's graffiti in verse, and a lot of it's kind of like short humorous verse, and
so that's pretty. I mean, I remember working with you on some of those, and that's just mostly great fun.
Yeah, those are mostly fun because they're meant to be frivolous verse, and you kind of can take a very light attitude towards it and just kind of try to replicate the effect, I think.
But in Goat Song, there's a lot of Vaginov's own like real poetry, and there are several poets who are major figures in the novel, who this is variously attributed to, and this is very hard. So I would say, at first I would like to give another shout out. I don't know if he's listening right now, but the wonderful translator Dmitry Manin, who lives in San Francisco, he has helped me. So he's actually working on a project right now of translating a whole collection of Vaginov's verse for a separate edition. And so I consulted with him, just asked his opinion about what I had come up with. But he and I have a little bit of a difference of opinion, because this is a little bit of a despairing moment for me, because I think that Vaginov's poetry can almost not be translated, and I don't say that lightly. Like I hope that everything can be translated. But the way I read his poetry, I read it as almost conceptual poetry, which is something we usually think of as happening a lot later, because it reads usually like eloquent rhyming verse, kind of sounds a little bit like poetry of the late 19th century, images also kind of from there. But what's really going on is that it's this kind of Frankenstein creation that is made out of these dead chunks, these dead chunks of old-fashioned, like utterly irrelevant verse. And so in this sense, I see it as conceptual, because I think that it's yet another level of satire on his part. And so from a poetics perspective, I think that it's almost impossible to translate, because these are chunks that are going to be recognizable as such by a Russian reader, particularly of Vaginov's time, and even by a well-informed Russian reader later. But how to build a construction like that in English, I cannot imagine how, because English readers haven't even been reading poetry very much for 100 years, right? Like, I mean, well, maybe I'm exaggerating, but we don't have the same kind of a fixed canon to draw on, the same way that like a word or phrase would be attributable to a specific poet, and you would get the trick of the poem. And so for that reason, and especially since that's important for these poet characters in the novels, that they're doing that kind of work, because it's in line with what they're doing in the novels, with this collecting and with this ineffectual collecting of things that are dead and no longer meaningful. It's very hard, right? I mean, we hope, I mean, I'm trying to use words in the poems that come up in the prose, so that you can kind of get a sense of how that's working, but it's very hard to answer briefly in the end. Yeah.
And just to really what Ainsley was saying before, it's a very different situation in later novels, because it's mostly found poems of various types, and I mean, and I think. And they're really offered as ephemera, right? Like it's something that will be graffitied in pencil somewhere, or that someone will hear sung on the street corner when they're walking by, or there's a great like very pretentious and terrible poem that the poet's roommate used as the sheet of paper to do like a typing exercise at work, and so like it's just on the back side of that sheet of paper, right? So like they're really parts of the material culture of this world, and so I for the most part try to I mean, obviously I try to get the sense as close as possible, but in terms of rendering it, I think my main goal is just to try to convey as well as I can to the English language reader what genre of thing this is. Like, make it sound like a song if it's supposed to be a song, make it sound like a really pretentious poem if it's supposed to be like a quasi-symbolist work, make it seem kind of light and quickly slapped together if it's going to be some graffiti on the side of a building, and to kind of maintain the various non-standard classes or genres of these things as well as possible. I think for the mode of voice songs that were mentioned before, I think we want to have a little bit more nuance. I think is there are in a lot of ways a more interesting kind of in themselves complex piece of recorded culture, and and also linguistically there's just more that we want to make sure that we're doing justice, so that's why we're doing a phone friend on those ones. So anyway, that's more or less my approach to the ones in the latter novels.
I'll ask a question from the point of view Globus books. And I know there are several books that are coming out, and there are already some translations that do exist. So what would you recommend to start with, and how would you place Vaginov in the frame of that time? Like, what would be your ideal shelf? Like, if I give you a section on my shelf in Globus, how would you compose it? Both, that's a question for Ainsley and for Geoff, so take a turn.
I mean, there is, I mean, there are a few ways to go about it, right? Like you can imagine a Soviet shelf in that period with a lot of kind of dark leaning satire, maybe, thought out with some Bulgakov and Platonov, and but I actually would kind of like to see it in just like a bizarre miscellany shelf, like multicultural, international writers from that same period, like Nathaniel West. It could be like the American representative. Have Vaginov, have unfortunately I don't know Italian novels well enough, but I feel like there would be some weird Italian futurist thing that we could have from the 20s that would fit in with it. To kind of take it out of the framing of Soviet culture and, have it be a kind of pan-modernist take on, a crisis of culture and a overflow of material culture, and kind of put in that kind of framing. I think that could be really effective.
I think this is great. It also occurs to me that, of course, in some ways, Vaginov himself in these novels makes his own bookshelf. I mean, literally, the characters spend a lot of time going around to use bookstores and finding, like, as Geoff said, the most random things they can. Basically, there's this, I don't know if it's hipster. I also think of it as kind of underdog cred. Right, like writing yourself into some kind of a strange canon of half forgotten greats, and so you could, that would be, if we're talking about dreams, of course, like that would be really entertaining to have Vaginov among his own books. And I was also thinking, I mean, like as a Slavic scholar, my first thought is just, what is he surrounded by in the kind of canon of our field? But that also gives me an opportunity. I agree with Geoff that I wouldn't want that. And it gives me an opportunity to say something that I thought about saying earlier, which is that it's something that I think is forgotten often about Vaginov, because of his cult status and because of the way that he became a kind of a poster child for unofficial culture, underground Soviet culture. Is that he died in the early years of Stalinism of tuberculosis, of natural causes. And much is made of the fact that there was apparently an order already written out for his arrest, but he died. And I have no doubt that he would have met an unpleasant end of an unnatural end if he had lived longer. But at the same time, I think that when we read the books, the habit is to read him along with all of these writers who will ultimately be repressed, killed, otherwise ruined by Stalinism, and he wasn't. And I think that there is this subtlety to the kind of criticisms that he makes that reflect the fact that it hadn't gotten quite so bad yet, right? I mean, he died before the really bad shit hit the fan, to be crude. And so I think reading him in more of this world context that he so much wanted to be a part of, right? Like many of the intellectuals of his time, seems more right.
Yeah, no, I love the idea of being his own bookshelf. I can already see like a display with like him. There's Hesiod, there's Apicius's cookbook. There's Suetonius would be there. Francois Villon would be there. It would be phenomenal.
I actually thought of this at the very beginning when Zarina mentioned that Globus has a wonderful selection of cookbooks.
There is a question coming in now from Linley Shimat, Liz, who is saying that, I'm going to read it. I'm interested in reproducing syntax and sentence structure. I think you mentioned long sentences. Are these normal in Russian or also strange there? In Arabic or in Dostoevsky, it's common.
I'd say on average, my experience as a translator, Russian sentences tend to be longer than English ones. But I think what we were talking about was that Vaginov takes that sometimes to another level, right? Like they're long even in the context of Russian, of typical Russian sentences. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah. And I think then only long, and sometimes they have a bit looser syntax. I mean, then like at least then some of the 19th century Russian novels I can think of that have like long sentences. I mean, like a long Tolstoy sentence is like, it's gonna have a lot of which and that clauses, and it's gonna be very neatly put together, and it's sort of very easy to break into like sub sentences and and all that. Whereas Vaginov's often a lot looser, and you have to kind of really look for the structure, and sometimes it's debatable whether the grammar totally holds up even in Russian. Usually it does, but so I think that adds a little bit of challenge, but I would agree with Ainsley that there's nothing like wildly out of the norm about his sentence writing.
This is a piece that occurs after an evening of old-fashioned music in the novel Goat Song. And this is one of the many kind of parties that happen in the novel that many of the characters have come to. The host is Kosta Kissinkin, who is the one who collects items of extraordinary bad taste, including a lot of pornographic items. And in this scene, you see a terrible night of the soul of Balm Kafkin, who has not been aware of this habit of his friend whom he otherwise admires. The dining room was suffused with light. On the walls, the remarkably intact plates with their landscapes and portraits from the imperial porcelain factory radiated their gilt. On the table stood wines in bottles, vodka in decanters. The little glasses sparkled. And all around was something pink, something red, something white, something pale blue. Nothing was missing. But the little old men and the elderly young men had the sense that this was just a copy, that everything real had died, that this was a kind of recollection, always less vivid than actuality. They suddenly felt sorrowful, so sorrowful. Furthermore, they noted that in order to arrange this evening, certain objects from the dining room had disappeared, had been sold. "Bring me my purse," Musi Dalmatova whispered to Balm Kafkin. "It's in Kosta Petrovich's room." Kosta Kissinkin's room was illuminated by the moon. The wind lifted up the edge of the velvet that was covering certain illustrations. And then Balm Kafkin saw something that he was not meant to see. He crushed the purse in his hands, opened his mouth, and sat down. "But what is that?" he thought. "What is that? A person with such subtle taste." And then above him, the velvet was alternately covering and again revealing dozens of naked bodies, men's and women's, in all manner of positions. He felt that something was not right in this house. "Snakes!" he screamed, "snakes!" and ran headlong out of the room. And back at the table, it seemed to him that there, leaning over, leaning back, laughing loudly, speaking, leaning in, lifting forks to their mouths with food of various colors, were snakes with little green hands, and that only he and Maria Petrovna were alive. He was particularly struck by the unknown poet. He noticed that the poet was utterly white, that his eyes were greenish, that he was no longer a young man at all. "Eat, eat," Kosta Kissinkin's aunties ran around the table. "Eat, eat." So Balm Kafkin is a virgin. And this troubles him tremendously throughout most of the novel. So this is part of his difficulty, in addition to the crisis of culture.
There is the whole, I feel like a meta level on which we took it around, because with the bookshelf where Vaginov books will appear in Vaginov books, and it can go and on and on and on. And thank you so much. We will have more series with literary translators. It's a part of our round table on literary translations. So if you have ideas, please contact me at Globus Books. Subscribe to our channel and look for the books. They're coming out sooner. We'll have the announcements. Read Vaginov and Geoff's and Ainsley's translations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zarina.
Bye.